Hello, Prime Media audiences. Welcome to Prime Logue. I am here, your host, Ladette Moleta. I'm here with a guest, Mr. Ajamo Baraka, who is joining us today. I am really grateful for Mr. Ajamo to joining us today. I would like to give him a few minutes to introduce himself. I'm very aware of his work, but just to introduce himself to our audiences, especially in Ethiopia. Mr. Ajamo, thank you so much for joining me again. Please take a moment and introduce yourself.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's indeed a pleasure to be with you to have this very important conversation. As you just shared with your audience, my name is Ajamo Baraka. I am the national organizer for the Black Alliance for Peace, a US-based organization that is committed to raising the awareness among African people in the US and the progressive community in general around the issues facing the global South and the planet related to US policies, in particular US war policies, and including also the policies of Western Europe. Our mission is to raise visibility of these situations that the US finds itself in, targeting nations in the global South, and to build opposition for the purpose of putting a brake on US and Western interventions. Our commitment is a commitment to peace within the tradition of Black opposition in the US, which is part of our internationalist responsibilities that we have taken on as a movement and as an organization.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. That's a great introduction. So let me start going straight to our discussion, and I wanted to discuss about media, since it's been an area that you have been discussing a lot in the last couple of weeks I've seen. What is the current landscape of media? Many news regarding CNN, Facebook is currently out there, and especially regarding countries like Ethiopia. What are your thoughts on that currently?
Well, it's a very interesting environment, and it's interesting that you connected up the issue of media, CNN with Facebook. And that's a very important and interesting kind of connection. Why? I think we forget that Facebook is supposed to be merely a platform for the exchange of information and ideas. But there's been tremendous pressure being put on Facebook to, in fact, operate as a publisher, determining content that is what is appropriate content to be shared and what content is deemed to be inappropriate. So they're acting as a publisher. CNN, of course, is a privately owned corporation, but many of us suggest that CNN is part of what we refer to as the ideological apparatus of the state. That is, even though it's privately owned, there's not much space between its positions, the worldview that it advocates, and that of the US state and of the ruling elements that we say control the US state. So right now, the environment is an environment in which the private corporations that call themselves media outlets and the state work in tandem when they are targeting certain states and when they're raising certain kinds of issues. Right now, one of the new villains, if you will, is the Ethiopian government. And so what we see in the US and indeed in the Western press is a coordinated effort to criminalize, delegitimize the Ethiopian state, to provide the political context for more aggressive direct interventions. Many of us believe that the objective is regime change for various reasons that I think we'll talk about. But what we see right now is a very hostile media environment when it comes to Ethiopia, a very distorted coverage of the conflict in Ethiopia, and an environment that we find very troubling, because we know that the situation is complex, and we see the absolute manipulation taking place among the US population, providing the framework and the grounding for public support of more aggressive actions when it comes to the situation in Ethiopia vis-a-vis the US state.
Thank you, Mr. Ajamo. I do want to follow up with a question from what you said. So where is this coming from? Is there financial benefits to media outlets, or is there a direct policy think tank that controls the media or the social media platforms, or where is the connection? I mean, we would like to think that medias are independent, but they also, obviously have clients and customers that they serve. And why is it that, platforms such as Facebook and CNN and so forth are directly linked to this, I should say, either propaganda or misinformation regarding to Ethiopia at this point?
Well, I think the simple response is that there's an ideological unity, if you will, between the corporate outlets and the state, that they share a set of common values and a worldview. And so when the state sets out certain policies geared toward advancing the interests of the state, we find that independent function that one would assume would be the role of the media, questioning those policies, critiquing the outcomes of various kinds of activities, and informing the public, we see that role has really been fundamentally changed over the last few decades. That in fact, what we find with these media outlets is a lockstep approach to US foreign policies. And instead of independent investigations, what we find is that these outlets operate almost like state propaganda units. So it's a very dangerous situation, but it's something that has profoundly changed and is connected, as you indicated in your question, is connected to the economic interests of these corporations. They are, in fact, corporations committed to capitalist development and a capitalist worldview. And they are beholden to their shareholders, but they also are patriots, if you will, in terms of being more than willing to parrot the positions of the US state. And so it means that many of us who are more critical, we find it very difficult to penetrate the corporations that control the media outlets. And so we are then sort of relegated to having to address US policies, attempting to access the public primarily through the alternative media, which is very difficult, but has not been impossible.
Wow. How do you view the situation in Ethiopia and the Horn currently? I mean, is there unity? Is there similarities? What about AFRICOM? What it's doing in the Horn of Africa? What's new or what's happening now that is different from before? And what are some of the things that other superpowers are doing regarding AFRICOM, or whether they're joining them or being against them?
Well, let me say this. I think the only thing that's new is the current conflict in Ethiopia, the conflict between the state and Tigray. What is consistent is the attempts on the part of the US to advance its geostrategic interests, working with various states and movements on the African continent and in other parts of the world. The Horn, of course, is a very important and strategic location for the US. And what we find is that they are attempting to try to reverse some of the developments that have taken place in the Horn, particularly with Ethiopia, where for 27 years, they had the TPLF in power that was more than willing to help to advance U.S. interests. In fact, we know under the leadership of the TPLF that Ethiopia invaded its neighbors, invaded Somalia, invaded Kenya, and was perpetuating a conflict with Eritrea. So, what that resulted in was not only advancing U.S. strategic interests through Ethiopia, but also playing right into the hands of balkanization on the African continent. And so that continues and it intensifies with new weapons. One of the most important new weapons for advancing U.S. interests on the African continent has been the establishment of the U.S. Africa Command, or AFRICOM, that was initiated in 2007, but formally launched on October 1st, 2008. That very next year, Barack Obama assumed the office of the presidency, being the first Black person as a U.S. president. And the significance of that was that there was a dramatic increase in the U.S. military presence on the African continent. In fact, a 1,900% increase in the U.S. presence on the African continent. We also know that as a part of that increase, we saw that the U.S. With its NATO allies attacked Libya, the most prosperous state on the African continent, and completely destroyed that state in 2011. We know that this is also the time when Ethiopia invaded its neighbors in 2011. And we saw a complete escalation of military conflicts and destabilization on the African continent that corresponds with the expansion of AFRICOM. And that is the basis for why the Black Alliance for Peace, for example, is now involved in a month-long campaign to bring attention, to bring awareness to the role of AFRICOM on the continent. We say that AFRICOM has been the instrument that has been used by the U.S. state to destabilize the African continent as their response to the competition that they find themselves in with the Chinese. So we find what is happening in the Horn very troubling, including the coup in Sudan, which is connected, of course, to the Horn, because we know that there is explanations for how the military forces in Tigray were able to recoup themselves. And so we are very troubled with the militarization of the African continent and the expanding conflicts on the African continent. And we are very much not just concerned, but actively educating and organizing in opposition to that activity on the part of the U.S. and their European allies.
Thank you, Mr. Ajamo. Yes, your organization is doing a lot in this, and I really appreciate that. What is the role of the Black community regarding this type of foreign policy? Both, I mean, especially in Africa, but more so also for the, for the Black voters in the U.S. What is the role? What can be done for the people in the continent? Obviously, we have social media platform that's making things much easier to reach people across the globe. But what are some of the plans or ideas that you have in regards to expanding this advocacy?
Well, what is actually happening concrete is the development of more effective transnational structures, Black-led structures that are committed to anti-imperialism. The campaign that we are waging right now is one of those attempts to raise the level of awareness of the Black population in the U.S. So that they understand the role of the U.S. on the African continent. But we also are reaching out and have developed effective ties throughout the African diaspora in Europe, in Latin America, where I now sit, for example, all committed to building what we refer to as the U.S. Out of Africa Network, connecting up our activities in the diaspora with activities on the African continent itself, and building what we hope will be an effective campaign and permanent organization to deal with the expanding role of the U.S. And its NATO allies on the African continent. So raising awareness, but also translating that awareness into concrete political opposition is what we have to engage in. We know that the issues on the African continent are serious. And one of the reasons why the Europeans are so able to be effective on the African continent is because of the generalized disorganization of the African masses, the relative weakness of many of the African states. And that's one reason why Ethiopia has been targeted. Ethiopia was, up until the war, one of the fastest growing economies on the African continent. But because of its relationships with the Chinese, because it's attempting to try to charter an independent course, they have been targeted, like many other states on the African continent. So the only way that Ethiopia can be protected and other progressive states in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, is through more effective anti-imperialist organizations. And we can't be afraid of using these terms like imperialism, because that is exactly what we're up against. And the Western states, they're absolutely clear what they are trying to do. And I think that those of us in the global South need to be as clear or clearer and more determined to protect the interests of our people and the sovereignty of our nations and states.
Great. Yes, because I think you mean another word for it would be, racism, because I don't know any military activities of African countries or other countries in the Western world. I mean, that's just a simple question right there. Do we have any African military presence in Europe or in the US? I mean, it's just a simple question.
Exactly. I mean, basically, we're talking about a certain kind of relationship, a relationship between Africa and the West, of what became the West, that really began in 1492 with the European invasion of the Americas, the conquest of the Americas, the beginning of an international slave trade that brought African labor to the Americas, that served as the material foundation for what emerged as the West. And so we identify what we see as the number one enemy of progress, the number one enemy of collective humanity. And we say that is the pan-European, colonial, capitalist, white supremacist patriarchy. Until power is taken from those elements, those nation states that emerge on the backs of African people and indigenous people in the Americas, and colonization globally, then collective humanity is threatened, because these states, this ruling class, they're committed to one thing and one thing only: the continuation of their hegemony. And their justification for hegemony is in fact informed by an inflated sense of who they think they are. This white supremacist ideology that we know has no historical basis. So yes, it's white supremacy, but white supremacy that is buttressed by structures of domination. And so we have to keep the focus on both, not just in Western people's heads, but those structures that continue white power. And that has to be the main target of our activity.
Do you foresee a movement underway in Africa, regarding Africa in general altogether?
Well, the movements are developing. I mean, there's a new I think momentum developing for a new kind of revolutionary Pan-Africanism on the African continent and in the diaspora. But we know that that movement is difficult because you have the entrenched power of these neo-colonial agents that make up most of the leadership of many of the African nations on the continent. But the African masses are organizing, and we're building structures of coordination between the African continent and the African diaspora. Black states in the Caribbean playing a very important role in that, and Black movements throughout Latin America, and of course in the US are playing very important roles in attempting to revitalize a more effective political opposition. Now that we know that the European powers are vulnerable, their power has been weakened, and we need to be able to take advantage of that with a more vigorous and more effective movement for Black liberation, revolutionary Pan-Africanism, and social transformation.
What do you mean by weakened?
That the material foundation of the West is their global capitalist system. But since 2008, that system has been in crisis. And the crisis deepened with the COVID crisis that resulted in disruptions in their global supply chains that collapsed the economies for a moment throughout the Western world. And that they have not effectively recovered from that yet. And that's why we see that there's been more militancy among workers in the US. There's struggles in Europe to protect the social safety net. And the rise of the political right in Western Europe, in the US, is a reflection of the weakened political stance of the ruling classes. They have a real serious legitimation crisis. So the crisis, the contradictions of the global colonial capitalist system has made the Western ruling classes more vulnerable. They haven't given up power, and we have not been able to take power. But there definitely has been a shift in their ability to impose themselves on the rest of global humanity.
Right, thank you. From your experience or history in international advocacy, can you recall a similar leader like Dr. Abiy Ahmed that was able to overcome the Western media campaign as well as Western aggression towards the country that they're leading?
Well, there have been a number of outstanding African leaders that have attempted to try to chart an independent course. But we know from our history also, too, that oftentimes those leaders are, in fact, targeted themselves. And that's what makes the situation so dangerous for the leadership of Ethiopia. They're under tremendous pressure right now. The entire West right now is mobilized against the leadership. And so his greatest protection, in fact, will be the organized masses of Ethiopia. But we can't dismiss the dangerous context that the president is operating in at this point in Ethiopian history.
Great. What do you ever foresee media outlets and African social media platforms? Ethiopia already has announced that that they're planning to build their own social media platform. But in general, do you see a network of medias and social media platforms that have anti-imperial outlooks to unite and to work on this subject, like as we see how coordinated the human rights advocates groups to aid organizations, to medias, to the social media, they are all very much so coordinated to the point we see their advocacy saying the same exact things with few, changes of words, coming from top officials to all the way to media outlets. Do you see that, foresee the coordination of anti-imperialist movement organizations getting together and joining hands in this movement?
Well, let's hope so. There has to be an objective. And we're seeing some degree of coordination, but right now our forces are very disconnected. But as we are able to maintain the integrity of states like Ethiopia, that can, once they are able to establish peace, might be in a position to help support the development of alternative media outlets on the African continent. It will make our efforts much more potentially effective. So yes, that has to be our objective. We've got to be in a position to tell our own stories and to be able to access the people, not only on the African continent, but globally. But in the meantime, what that means is we have to find other creative ways to coordinate among ourselves. We have to be committed to experiment with efforts at coordination until we're able to experience that sort of qualitative leap when our resistance movement goes to a much higher level.
Mr. Adjamo, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking your time while you were traveling and currently in Colombia and joining us here in Prime Media Ethiopia. I hope to have you again, and I'm pretty sure that your message is going to be heard very well. I hope that we will meet again sometime. Thank you so much. If you have anything to say or if you have any last message, I will give it to you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. Please, for anyone who's interested, go to the blackallianceforpeace.com to get more information on our alliance. There you can also join the U.S. Out of Africa Network and help us with our Shutdown African campaign. We're in this together, folks. And only together and organized can we be victorious. So thank you for inviting me. I'm quite sure we'll have more opportunities to discuss all of the important issues facing the African continent and African people.
Thank you, Mr. Ajabo. Prime Media audiences, this was our special time with Mr. Ajamo. I'll be back with another guest. Thank you.